Hello everyone. Thank you for joining this first webinar in our three-part Bridging the Gap webinar series. Today's webinar is Understanding the Group Dynamics and the Role of Family Engagement Advocacy Groups. I'm Malika Stubbs-Wilson and I'm the Program Manager for our Family Engagement Advocacy Groups and the Bridging the Gap Network at Drug Free Action Alliance. And the final slide on this presentation will have all of my contact information. So for those of you who don't know Drug Free Action Alliance, let me tell you a little bit about who we are. While a number of our programs are known nationally, Drug Free Action Alliance is a statewide, private, nonprofit prevention agency that was founded in 1987. Drug Free Action Alliance's mission is to provide leadership and foster networks to promote safe and drug-free communities throughout Ohio, and it's accomplished with the strategies that you see listed there on your screen. And that includes providing a statewide and community environmental changes to reduce substance abuse, increasing public awareness of substance abuse and its harmful effects, and helping to develop the statewide prevention infrastructure to reduce substance abuse. So as a quick reminder, there are three parts in this webinar series. Today's is the Understanding the Group Dynamics and the Role of Family Engagement Advocacy Groups. And for each webinar, we'll provide those that are in Ohio with an RCH certificate, and for those that are outside of Ohio, you'll receive a certificate of completion. In order for you to receive a certificate of attendance, you must attend the full webinar and complete a brief evaluation. You'll receive a link to the evaluation in an email, and if you're a group of people who are attending the webinar from one computer, please remember to have each participant complete an evaluation. If you didn't already complete a group sign-in sheet, we can email one to you immediately following this call. Group sign-in sheets are necessary for each person to get credit for attendance, so even if you're sharing one computer, each person needs to be accounted for in the group sign-in sheet. So before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's event. There's two ways you can hear the webinar today. One is through the speakers on your computer. The other is by using your phone. For those of you who are listening through computer speakers, if you experience problems, you might want to consider dialing in on your phone. However, keep in mind that there's no charge to listen through your computer speakers, but know that if you dial in on your phone, you would be billed just like any other long-distance call. If you need technical assistance due to any webinar audio or visual problems, just write down the number that's on your screen, and you'll be able to get help. You will be muted throughout the entire 1-hour session today. If you want to ask questions or communicate with me, you can do so by typing a comment or a question in the question area. So let me draw your attention to the control panel. It's located on the right side of your screen. You can open or collapse the control panel by hitting the red arrow. If you can't see your control panel, click the red arrow to open it. Please note that we will not be using the chat box in today's session, but we will be using the question section that's at the bottom of the control panel. Just type in your question, click send, and the questions will be submitted to me. Other participants will not be able to see your questions. Only the organizers of this webinar, which is just myself and 2 other staff members from Drug Free Action Alliance who are assisting today. You can ask your questions anytime throughout the session, but keep in mind that we'll only be answering the questions during one stopping point, and at the end of the presentation we'll open up for questions again. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Member Center at Drug Free Action Alliance's website, as well as links to other helpful resources. During the presentation, there will be opportunities beyond asking questions for your involvement in today's webinar through the use of polls. Poll questions will be launched at various points of the webinar, and you'll be asked to participate by answering poll questions provided to you in real time. It's a way to keep you engaged in the webinar and also allows you to interact with other webinar participants. You may want to close the other computer programs on your screen to help prevent any screen lag time as we get started here. Now, everyone should have received handouts for this presentation via a link that was emailed last week. These handouts are just meant to give you a more in-depth reading on the topics that we're going to cover today. So if you don't have them in front of you, don't worry about it. They'll continue to be available at the link that's on your screen and the link that was emailed to you. And they'll also be available in the Drug Free Action Alliance Member Center as soon as this presentation has been uploaded there. Your certificates will be emailed within 30 days, and we are ready to get started. So the learning objectives, we are going to be focusing today on understanding the dynamics and the role of family engagement advocacy groups. You're going to be learning how to identify and understand the signs of common grief and complicated grief among advocacy group members, some of the key signs that you'll want to look for to identify the readiness of members to advocate for change after they've experienced trauma or grief, and some strategies for effective self-care and coping with loss, as well as how to balance the group time with getting support and giving support, as well as with taking action. So we're going to get started here with taking a real quick opportunity to hear from you guys. We want to ask you a question on just how many of you are familiar with the concept of family engagement advocacy groups. And your options are either yes, you definitely are, you've heard of this and you're familiar with it, or no, you're not familiar with it, or you're not quite sure. You may have heard of it, but you're not sure if you know what family engagement groups are. Okay, it looks like we've got just about all the votes in. Okay, it looks like the majority are not familiar, and some might have heard of it but aren't quite sure if they know exactly what they are, and a few are in fact familiar, but most are not. So we're going to move forward here and take a look at what exactly makes a group a family engagement advocacy group. Well, here at Drug Free Action Alliance, we have defined family engagement advocacy groups that we work with as individuals that have been motivated by the loss of a loved one due to a drug-related death, addiction, or relapse, who have come together for two reasons. And those two reasons are to provide support to one another, and the second is to take action to create community change. Now, this definition of family engagement advocacy groups has continued to evolve as the groups have grown across the state. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it certainly has begun to expand beyond just drug-related death, addiction, or relapse to violence-related deaths and others where family members have come together. But still, the common bond is that they have still the goal of providing support and taking action. So here there's a model that shows you a little bit more in depth the dynamics of the family engagement advocacy groups. So you'll notice that on the top is the support group component. That's where we're going to spend the most focus in part one of this webinar, is looking at the support group dynamics and what is involved and what needs to be understood. And the goal of the support groups is to process grief and share resources with the ultimate goal of working towards healing. But what also exists, and is the important part of a family engagement advocacy group as well, is the action group component, where members come together to raise awareness in their communities and also to participate in advocacy activities. And the ultimate goal of that part of the engagement advocacy groups is preventing the same tragedy that might have occurred in their family from happening anywhere else. Now, there are many notable people who have become family advocates and have made huge impacts in their communities and nationally. And the 5 people that you have listed there on your screen are all 5 people who had tragedies that occurred in their lives and came together to, well, they didn't come together with them, these 5, but they went out and decided to advocate and make changes. So we're going to ask real quickly, I'm curious of just how many people are familiar with these famous nationally known advocates. If you could just check all that you are familiar with, each one of the people that are listed here, if you are familiar with who they are and what they did. Okay. Well, it looks like quite a few people certainly know who John Walsh. I'm going to go through all of these just quickly. Candy Lightner was the founder of MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Sarah Brady was the wife of Jim Brady, and she became active in the gun control movement a few years after the shooting of her husband. And many of you are probably familiar with the Brady Bill, which might jog your memory of who Sarah Brady is. Lois Smart is the wife of Ed Smart. Lois and Ed Smart had Elizabeth Smart was their daughter, and when she was kidnapped, they began the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, and both her parents and her are very active advocates and major supporters of RAD Kids and trying to help prevent crimes from happening to children. Joan Barry was responsible for the Janiyah Berry Act of 2007 after her daughter was killed, and that act made it mandatory that when a person is arrested for a violent felony, they would have a biological specimen for the purposes of DNA analysis taken. And then John Walsh, we all know, has been an active advocate for getting criminals off of the street after the murder of his son, Adam. So I show this slide to just illustrate the impact that when family members have been touched with tragedies, the impact that they can make, the huge changes they can make when it comes to policy and advocating for change with the goal of trying to prevent the same tragedy that occurred in their families from happening to anyone else. So why are we seeing such a rise in advocacy groups, the family engagement advocacy groups, and in Ohio in particular? We have seen a huge number. All of you received in your handouts, there was a map of our current membership, which actually is a little bit higher than what's on that map. The map that you received, there wasn't even any space to continue on that current map, the number of groups that are involved. But one of the reasons we're up to about 33 groups right now in Ohio is that on average, there's 4 Ohioans that are lost every day to a drug-related death, which accounts for nearly 130 preventable deaths that occur each month in our state. And families were coming forward right and left with having dealt with this tragedy and wanting to form groups that could make a change in their community and some on a state level. And as these groups continued to grow, there was other family members who were facing maybe gun-related deaths as well, and they said, we want to come together as well when they were seeing this movement and the impact that was being made by the other families. So we've seen quite a growth of these groups throughout the state, and we've heard from others that they're seeing some similar things in their states as well. So as we've worked with the family engagement advocacy groups, we have noticed that there is a continuum that needs to be paid attention to. We see that people coming in having dealt with a trauma of loss, whether it was their child or it was a sibling or it was a parent, they are needing to receive and give support. And many of them then choose to want to go on and make a change in their community and are needing to learn what works and to take action. So the first thing to keep in mind as you work with these family members, and I should note that some people on this call may be family members themselves who have dealt with a tragedy. Some people on this call, I believe, are also representing agencies or organizations that are partnering with some of these family members. And whatever your role might be, it's important to understand that self-care and support are essential first steps. And everyone who's ever had an experience with flying, you know that the first message when they're going through all the safety information, that they discuss the oxygen masks. If the oxygen masks are put down, to make sure that you apply yours first before trying to assist anyone else. And that's what this portion is about, is that the self-care and support needs to be in place before anyone goes out wanting to advocate and start making changes. So we're going to discuss what's involved with self-care and support. And the first thing is understanding the grief that members are coming in with. And this quote by Vicki Harrison really sums this up very well, in that grief is being like an ocean. It comes on waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm, sometimes it's overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim. And the support group component of the family engagement advocacy group certainly is an opportunity in which people are learning to swim, learning to cope. So there's 4 areas here that we are going to cover in this section, and that includes understanding grief, the coping mechanisms that many of the members may be employing, the receiving of support and the giving of support, and what those look like, and how to be empathetic and understanding as people are going through each of those phases. So first, understanding grief. Some of the causes of grief can include loss of a loved one, particularly when it's unexpected. Then there's loss of health for oneself or a loved one, loss of a cherished dream. And we have groups that have a makeup of members that come from each one of these different groups. Those who have, when it says loss of health, there's people who have members who are actively addicts, and they have come together for support, and they are also, as they have received the support they needed, wanting to move on to advocate for assistance in helping with proper treatment in their area or increasing access to treatment. And then you also have people who they feel a sense of the loss of a cherished dream that they might have had for their children, or for those who are perhaps in recovery in a cherished dream. So next, I wanted to take a look at the difference between some common grief experiences and complicated grief experiences. Because as people come into a support group setting, they are going to definitely have everyone will be able to recognize, for the most part, some very common experiences. And those include shock and disbelief, sadness, guilt, anger, fear, and it can vary. The list goes on. And in one of the handouts that you received, it has a lot more of an in-depth description of common grief experiences, as well as complicated grief experiences as well, where someone, when it's getting complicated, they may feel like life isn't worth living anymore, have a lost sense of purpose in life. And it's important to understand the difference between the two and when you're seeing complicated grief, because in a support group setting, someone who is stuck in a place of complicated grief will not be able to receive what they need from the support group setting. They will likely need professional assistance, a grief counselor, someone to help them move through. So it's important to understand that the difference between common grief experiences and complicated grief experiences. And this can be very difficult, because complicated, for the first few months, normal grief can look very much like complicated grief. So you'd have to see where they are at that moment for our first question and answers. So we're pulling together the questions that have come through. So if you could give us just one moment, we will get to some questions that have been being asked. Okay, it looks like so far everyone's following through. We do not have any questions at the moment. I'll tell you, but please remember that you can type into the question box to send any questions, and we'll have another pause for questions at the end of the webinar. But I'll mention one question that I get very commonly when I'm giving this presentation, is asking about the advocacy and the support group, that both of those components necessary for a family engagement advocacy group. There's some who would like to leave out the support group component and just be advocating for change in their community. And we have found that with the groups that have been most successful and had the most change, it's been beneficial for them to have a support group component where they're able to deal with a lot of the issues that we've just gone through and working through grief and coping strategies. So we've advised, based on our experience with the groups that we've seen in Ohio, that you do have the support group component in place as well. All right, we're going to take a moment to do a poll. And I'm wondering how many have ever participated in a grief support group, either as a participant or as a facilitator? Either one. Just a yes or a no. Okay. And I see here that majority have not been a participant in a grief support group. But those who have, we're going to be going through some of that in just a moment. So I will repeat that if there's things that you missed that you'd like for me to go back to, a slide or something that you did not get to hear all that I had to say, please send that in your question box, and when we get to the end I can go back through something that might have been important that you missed. And I'm going to talk again on the complicated grief. Just to I want to just make sure that I've hit on the key points there, then I'll keep moving through. The key points again were understanding the difference between the two experiences. The common grief experiences are listed here, and they're much more in depth on the handouts that you received. And the complicated grief experiences are discussed in the handout as well. But the person who's going through complicated grief, I described it on the following slide, and I've described it a couple times as being in a chronic heightened state of mourning, and that common grief experiences early on can look very similar to complicated grief experiences. It's just that you'll see that continuing and not letting up even after some time has passed. So I'm going to move forward here, and again I apologize for some of the issues that we had here with audio, but if there's slides that I went through and you weren't able to hear everything that I said on them, again I encourage you to use the question box to type in any questions that you had or a slide that you'd like me to return to, and when I get to the end of this presentation I will go back to those and address them. So we did our poll here leading us into this next section, and the poll I had asked how many people had ever been a part of a support group, a grief support group, just to get an idea of how many people already had some experience with this. And I asked that you be comfortable with chiming in as I go through some of the important things to keep in mind with any personal experiences that you might have had that you would like to share. And you can put that in the question box and just still post it as a comment. So we're looking here at the coping strategies. You remember that in the slide that had the quote from Vicki Harrison, and she talked about the ebbs and flows and the waves, and when the waters get rough, just having to learn to swim. And the coping strategies that we employ during grief are the ways that we do learn to swim, and it's in these support groups that we can hear from each other what types of coping strategies are working and what's being effective. But you want to keep in mind as you are forming a group that you're seeing the difference between positive and negative coping and some positive coping strategies that can be offered. You'll see here in this graphic a person who begins at a place of grief. There's two options. Outside of just staying in the bed and not going anywhere, if they want to move on with life, they're going to have to choose a way to cope and a way to move on. And if they're choosing some of the negative choices are isolation. The bottom graphic, the first bottom graphic, is illustrating someone who has just isolated themselves. And that's an inclination. I hear all the time people who've said that they don't want to speak to anyone or see anyone. The grief is too overwhelming. The thought of going out in public or reaching out and talking about their experience feels too overwhelming, and so they may isolate. But we know that the healthier option is when that person is ready and they're able is to reach out for support. And that's the first graphic on the top line, is showing someone that is reaching out for that first time and trying to receive support. Some of the other negative coping can include substance abuse or substance use, anger, not being able to just decide that this is something that has occurred and moving through the stages of grief, and just staying chained to the negativity and the intensity of that negativity, where some more of the positive coping strategies include the support group itself, coming together as a group and eventually getting to a place perhaps where you'll be able to speak about what your experience has been. And as we'll talk about in some slides later, not everyone comes into this setting ready to speak, and certainly not ready to necessarily speak in front of an audience, which we've seen with some family engagement advocacy groups that we're still figuring out some of these parts. They have had people come in who've had tremendous things, just a horrible trauma happen, and they are wanting them to go out and go speak at a school perhaps and share their story with people before they're ready to do that. They may not even be ready in a small group of people with similar experiences yet. But that's the first step, is coming together and being able to speak within the support group setting. You'll also notice a little treadmill there with someone running on it, where a positive coping strategy that can be suggested is to just simply go just walking, jogging, running, the idea of it working the left brain and the right brain and the forward movement of it. And it actually is a very effective coping strategy when sometimes there's just not anything else that you can figure you can do to work through what you're currently feeling. And the last figure in the positive coping on the top is showing a little meditating figure, and that's to represent just also remembering to stay in touch with yourself and what you're feeling and experiencing, because sometimes people are at such a heightened state of grief that they'll do a million other things and a million things for other people so that they don't have to focus on what they are dealing with or what they're going through or what stage they might be in. And so staying in touch with what you're feeling and where you are in your stages is very important as well. So here's just a few examples of some specific examples that can be, as people come into groups, some things that can be offered as suggestions for positive coping strategies. Turning to supportive friends and family, talking to a therapist or grief counselor, and that is one that, as I mentioned, is very important when someone's going through complicated grief and that they don't have the support that would be able to address that. They could go to a therapist or grief counselor, which is why some of the support groups that have formed have maintained a list of people that are available in their area to deal with complicated grief. Also taking care of oneself and planning ahead for grief triggers. And it's a common theme now as support groups have continued to meet and they move along and begin to grow. They have started to offer information on how to plan for grief triggers as new members come in and realize that there's going to be some time that even as they have gone through a lot of healing, that they may just be in their car listening to a song that triggers their grief all over again, or a birthday that comes up or a holiday that comes up. So it's important to remind members and to keep in mind for oneself if they're doing this that there can be things that will trigger your grief and to plan for those when possible. And if nothing else, just planning in the sense of knowing that it can happen. And this can just be particularly tricky for people as they've gone into, they've been in those stages of giving and receiving support, and now they've moved forward and they're advocating for change, and then something triggers that grief. And they have to remember that that strong support system is still there for them and to actively be involved in it so that they can be dealing and addressing with those issues. So next I want to look at some of the support group fundamentals, because I get very frequently people say, well, we understand support groups are very important to have, but I don't know how to go about starting a support group. I don't know about the things that I need to consider with starting a support group, which is why it can be really easy to want to skip that step and just focus on the advocacy side. But as I had mentioned earlier, it is a very important component of a family engagement advocacy group that they are having a support group side. So a couple of these slides I want to just focus on some of the fundamentals to keep in mind. And first and foremost, the meeting content being relevant for the members' needs. And when a support group first forms, that's a little bit easier to keep in mind because the main people forming it know what their needs are and they're meeting those. But as time goes on and as the group grows, and also as the other arm of the group, which is the advocacy side, begins to grow as well, you want to make sure that the members' needs in that support group are continuing to be met. The ultimate goal, remember, for the support group component is healing, as you remember in the model that I showed in the earlier slides. So you don't want to lose sight of that and making sure that all members' needs are met. Also keeping in mind that that's why a lot of the groups are pretty homogeneous. There's some where there's members who didn't have anywhere else that they could go, where all of the members may have lost a child to a drug-related death, for example, and then there's someone who had a child that was lost to gun violence, or maybe just a child who is currently in recovery, and they'd like a support group. So the ideal scenario might be that they'd be with other parents who are dealing with a similar situation, but if they don't have that support group setting, they may join the group of parents who have lost a child. And in those types of situations, it's just making sure that your member content is still keeping everyone in mind and meeting the needs of all of the members, even when some of their needs may be a little bit different. Making sure that the meeting location is convenient and accessible to the majority of the members, and that the meetings are scheduled, that they're being scheduled adequately for the members, around people's work schedules, family obligations, et cetera, just trying to be able to make it as accessible as possible for everyone to be able to attend. And checking in and making sure that the members are satisfied with the conduct of the group, because there's rules that each group can set down and make sure that people are feeling comfortable with them so that they feel their confidentiality and everything is being kept, and that members are satisfied with their level of participation in the group. I mentioned a little bit earlier that some people may come in and not be ready to speak at all, while others want to make sure that they have an opportunity to speak, to be able to share during the group time. So you want to make sure that everyone is satisfied with their level of participation, and checking in on changing needs of the members, and keeping in mind how the group will be publicized throughout the community. So more on the support group fundamentals. Keeping the support group discussions confidential. And this is, most of the time, it's a given in a support group setting, but because family engagement advocacy groups also have the advocacy component, there's a whole separate time that they may be getting together with coalitions or other agencies and organizations in their community. And you want to remember that the support group discussions shouldn't come into the advocacy settings. So the time for support groups and the discussions and things that are dealt with there should be kept confidential, and keeping that in mind so that people can feel comfortable being in both of those roles. Listening and supporting support group members without criticizing or passing judgment. Also very important, of course, again, for making sure that people are being able to feel comfortable where they are, and that you're meeting them where they are currently in their stage and what grief they may be going through. Respecting each member's personal situation, as we talked about, they differ from person to person. So understanding that each person's coming there with their story, with what they've dealt with, and respecting what their situation might be. Be realistic about what the group can accomplish. This gets particularly tricky as the groups build or they get larger, and when the advocacy component starts to intersect, you want to keep it realistic with what can be accomplished, and make sure that the goals of the advocacy group are not coming into the support group and trying to accomplish those goals within that setting. And rotating the risks and responsibilities so that you can avoid burnout. And this comes up quite a bit because the people who start the support groups commonly end up feeling very burnt out. I get calls regularly from people who are just feeling like, oh my gosh, I feel so overwhelmed, and I'm trying to do this and do that, and I'm running this and running that. And usually it's just reminding them that they can turn over responsibility to other members within the group on certain things, and just try and rotate through tasks, because it really will get overwhelming, and the group can fall apart if no one else is being given responsibilities. Eventually people may stop coming or not feel so needed or not feel like they're being able to participate wholly, and the person who's handling everything can very quickly get burned out, especially if they're on the other hand also doing the advocacy side of things as well. So remembering to rotate tasks, and then developing a network of peers and professionals for support. And it's nice to keep an active list of those peers and professionals within the group so that you can share those with members as they're coming in. So some of the do's to keep in mind: accepting where the grieving person is at when they come in to the group setting, listening with compassion and suspending judgment, realizing that sometimes all the person might need is to just have you be there and be present. They may not need you to have something profound and deep to say. Sometimes just your presence is enough, and sometimes just their presence, being there in the group, is enough without them needing to have anything to say. And recognizing, again, that everyone grieves at their own pace and in their own time. Very important. And then a couple quick don'ts to keep in mind. Even though we do need to keep in mind that what healthy and negative coping, positive and coping strategies look like, not telling people that they should be coping better now, so that there's some judgment on how soon they should be looking, or their coping should be looking healthier. We don't want to be judgmental about grieving processes because it's such an individual and personal experience, and not telling a bereaved person what they should feel or do, certainly not supporting any false hopes or misconceptions, and giving advice about just being busy or getting involved, forgetting about the past and making the best of it, or changing the subject. This comes up quite frequently, that I will hear people saying that sometimes people will change the subject very quickly when they've brought up the name of their loved one or something about them, because they don't want them to be feeling uncomfortable, but really letting the person decide when they want to change the subject. Okay. So we are now, I just want to look at the, here we've gone through the receiving and the giving support, and you saw this slide earlier on, and I just wanted to come back and reiterate the cycle that occurs as people are coming into the family engagement advocacy groups. They may be there at first needing to receive support, then a part of that is wanting to give support, with eventually they are going to want to, some will eventually want to go over and do community change. And the learning what works part is what then becomes key, because after people have received the information that they need to help them towards the healing process, and those who now decide they want to make change, some may go out and blindly be trying to do things that they gut instinctually think might work. And we want to encourage that people are instead learning what works. The evidence-based strategies that we've found in prevention are effective and work. And so the next two webinar series is going to focus on how family engagement advocacy groups can effectively work through using evidence-based strategies in their advocacy work, as they then in the webinar 3 look at taking action. So we have got some time here for questions, and I know that there were some people that had trouble with audio, so I am going to pause here for one moment while we get questions that were coming through. Just one moment. Don't forget, if you have questions that you are holding on to, now is the time to type them into the question section of the box. And don't worry if you need me to go back to anything that just wasn't heard in the first part, if you'd had any trouble with hearing that. So we'll pause for just a moment and wait for any questions that are coming through.
And Malika, we do not have any questions at this time. However, if you would like to pose a question, you can enter your question in the question section on your toolbar.
Does anyone have there were any questions about the continuum, or that's something that commonly people want to get more information about, is understanding how that continuum, the importance of each one of those stages. But if we've gone through that sufficiently, let's give a moment in case anyone's typing any questions out. But hopefully no questions means that we have covered everything quite adequately. Please remember that if there are slides that you'd like for me to return to and just that you'd like to just see them up again and have me comment on them if you didn't hear all that I had said about them, I can do that as well. All right. Well, I'm going to
And there
also
are
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, Malika. There are a couple of logistical questions. The first is, what do I need to do for the sign-up sheet? You mentioned, should I be filling something out? For the sign-up sheet or the sign-in sheet for multiple listeners, Karen can email that to you. We just need to have a record of everyone that's attended the session, and we'll also need an evaluation for each person who has attended that session, which will also require their email address so we can send that evaluation questionnaire to them. And registering for the group, again, is checking with Karen, and she can send you that registration, and she'll, once the evaluation is complete, we can compare the two, and then you'll get your certificate of attendance for both. And those are the only two questions that I have right now. Malika, back to you.
Okay. Well, I have just placed up here my contact information so that if questions do arise, you are able to ask those directly to my email, or my phone number's there as well. The Drug-Free Action Alliance website is posted there, and you can also go there to get a copy of the webinar, which I'm hoping the audio will be better with the recording. I'm not sure how that might work, or we might re-record it. Yes, I was being told that if we're able to re-record the webinar in its entirety, and we'll have that posted on the Member Center so that you're able to catch anything that might have been missed today. So Derek, if there's no other questions that have come through.
No other questions at this time.
Okay. Well, there's a few little reminders I was going to give, but it looks like those got covered in the questions that were just asked. So we're going to go ahead and conclude if there's no questions. Well, we thank you very much for your participation today. And remember that parts 2 and 3 are coming up. Part 2 will be held February 12th at 11 a.m., and that is on what works in prevention, the lessons learned from our past. And Part 3 will be on February 19th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., and those times are Eastern Standard Time. And Part 3 is what works in prevention, guiding principles for success. So again, thank you for being on this call, and we look forward to having you all involved in the next series, or in the next Part 2. Bye-bye.